The afternoon light slanted through the library windows of Bancroft Manor in pale golden streams, illuminating dust
Will you
motes
marry
that
me?
drifted like tiny spirits
Yes,
through
a
the still
thousand
air.
yes.
Eleanor
I love you.
Bancroft sat
I love
curled
you
in the
too.
worn leather chair by the eastern window, her favorite refuge in all of Newport, with John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women open in her lap. She was 22 years old and she had been invisible for most of them. The pages were soft
This is a
beneath her
disaster.
fingers,
We must act now.
edges
I
rounded
know,
from years
but
of
how?
handling.
The board won't
The
wait.
leather
We
binding
find
was
a way.
cracked,
We have
but
to.
comfortable in her hands, like an old friend's embrace. She had just reached Mill's assertion that denying women education was not protection, but imprisonment, when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel shattered the library's peaceful silence. She's returned, Miss Vivian has returned from Boston. The housemaid's excited cry echoed through the manor's stone corridors, followed by the rapid patter of feet ascending and descending staircases. Doors opened and closed. Voices rose in cheerful greeting. Even Mrs. Patterson, their aging housekeeper, could be heard hurrying down the main staircase with uncharacteristic speed, her keys jangling at her waist. Eleanor looked up from her book, marking her place with a finger, and listened as the household stirred to life with an energy it rarely possessed these days. The manor had been quiet for so long, too quiet, haunted by debts no one spoke of openly, and a desperation that hung in the air like morning fog over the Atlantic. She remained in her chair, watching the dust motes continue their lazy dance, undisturbed by the commotion beyond the library doors. Her sister had been to the Modiste in Boston, a 3-day journey that had consumed the household's conversation for the past week. New gowns for the season, the finest silks, colors that would complement Vivian's golden hair and rose-petal complexion. Eleanor had heard it all discussed in exhaustive detail, though no one had thought to ask if she might need new gowns as well. Not that it mattered. Eleanor had long ago accepted her role in the family tableau, the shadow to Vivian's light, the footnote to her sister's story, the daughter who existed in the margins of every family portrait and every dinner conversation. She returned her attention to Mill, but the words blurred before her eyes. Through the library's half-open door, she could hear her sister's voice, bright and musical, like bells chiming across water. "Oh, Mrs. Patterson, you should see the emerald silk. The modiste said it would make my eyes look like precious gems. And the cream lace with the pearl embroidery, Father will adore it, I'm certain." "I'm sure you'll be the belle of every ball, Miss Vivian," Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice warm with genuine affection. Eleanor closed her book quietly and rose from her chair, moving to the window that overlooked the manor's front courtyard. Below, servants were unloading trunk after trunk from the carriage, each presumably filled with finery that would make Vivian even more dazzling than nature had already rendered her. Vivian Bancroft stood in the center of the activity, like a sun around which planets orbited, her golden hair catching the September light, her face animated with excitement. She was beautiful, there was no denying it. Society had proclaimed it since her debut 3 years ago, and the proclamation had only grown louder with time. Perfect features, perfect bearing, perfect charm. Eleanor turned away from the window and caught her own reflection in the small mirror that hung beside the bookshelf. Dark hair pulled back simply, gray eyes that were too large for her face, features that were pleasant enough but utterly unremarkable. She was not ugly precisely, but she was not Vivian. And in the world they inhabited, that single fact defined everything. The library door burst open and Vivian swept in, still wearing her traveling cloak, her cheeks flushed from the journey. For a moment, Eleanor saw something flicker across her sister's perfect face, something that might have been exhaustion or sadness or a weariness that had nothing to do with travel. But it passed, quickly replaced by Vivian's usual bright enthusiasm. "Isabel, there you are. I should have known I'd find you buried in books." Her tone was affectionate, without malice, which somehow made it worse. Vivian had never been cruel, never been unkind. She simply existed in a different sphere, entirely moving through the world with an ease Eleanor could never quite manage. "Welcome home," Eleanor said, managing a genuine smile. Whatever complicated feelings she harbored about her sister, she did love her. It was impossible not to love Vivian, who had never been deliberately hurtful, who simply couldn't help being exactly what society valued most. "You must come see the gowns," Vivian insisted, crossing to take Eleanor's hands. "The modiste has outdone herself this time. There's a blue one, a soft periwinkle, that I think would suit you wonderfully. I had her make it up in your salon. It will need altering, of course, but—" "That was thoughtful," Eleanor interrupted, gently squeezing her sister's hands. "Thank you." Vivian's expression flickered again with that same indefinable emotion, guilt perhaps, or pity, but it passed quickly. "Come then, I want your opinion on how I should wear my hair for the season's first events." You always have the best eye for these things, even if you pretend not to care about fashion. Eleanor followed her sister from the library, leaving Mill behind on the chair. The manor's quarters, which had seemed so peaceful moments ago, now thrummed with energy centered entirely on Vivian's return. They passed two maids carrying hat boxes, both of whom curtsied to Vivian and looked straight through Eleanor as though she were merely part of the wallpaper. She was used to it. Being invisible had its own peculiar comfort. No one expected anything from shadows. The late afternoon found Eleanor in the small parlor adjacent to her father's study, ostensibly reading but actually seeking the quiet warmth of the fire. The early autumn chill had crept into the manor's bones, and funds for extra coal were scarce, though no one spoke of such things openly. The Bancrofts were still Bancrofts, after all, still respected in Newport society, still invited to the right parties, still greeted with the proper deference. No one needed to know they were drowning. The sound of raised voices filtered through the study door, muffled but unmistakable. Eleanor recognized Mr. Pembroke's voice, the family solicitor whose visits had become increasingly frequent and increasingly grim over the past year. 4 months, Senator Bancroft. Perhaps less if your creditors grow impatient. Eleanor's hands stilled on her book. 4 months. Not 6 as she'd heard whispered before. 4. There must be something. Her father's voice was tight with desperation, stripped of the authoritative boom that had once commanded attention in the halls of the state legislature. The estate, surely we can borrow. The estate is mortgaged to the hilt, sir. You've borrowed against every acre, every asset. Unless you find a substantial infusion of capital, and I mean substantial, Senator, upwards of $500,000, you will lose everything. The title will remain, but the manor, the lands, the income, all of it will be forfeit. The silence that followed was heavy enough to press against Eleanor's chest. $500,000, an impossible sum. The kind of money that could save kingdoms or topple them. Then Vivian must marry well, her father said finally, his voice hard with resolve. And quickly. Sir, Duke Nathaniel Marlowe is seeking a wife. Have you heard? He's been in mourning these 8 years, but rumor has it he's finally ready to remarry. Vivian could be the answer to everything. Mr. Pembroke's voice carried a note of caution. His Grace is notoriously particular, Senator. Many have tried to capture his attention. Many have failed, and with respect, your daughter, beautiful as she is, would be competing against. Vivian will succeed where others have failed. Harrison Bancroft's voice cut through the solicitor's objections like a blade. She must. Our entire future depends on it. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, the book forgotten in her lap. 4 months, complete ruin. And Vivian, beautiful, perfect. Vivian was to be the sacrifice that saved them all. The study door opened abruptly. Eleanor barely had time to look down at her book, feigning absorption, as her father strode past the parlor entrance without so much as a glance in her direction. His face was set in hard lines, his mind clearly racing through calculations and schemes. He passed within 3 feet of where she sat and did not see her. Eleanor exhaled slowly, the familiar ache of invisibility settling in her chest like a stone. But beneath the ache was something else now, a growing dread, because she knew her father, knew his desperation, knew that when Harrison Bancroft set his mind to something, he pursued it with the single-minded determination that had once made him a formidable politician. And Vivian, for all her beauty and charm, was not suited to be bartered like livestock. Evening brought a return to the manor's usual rhythms. Dinner was a quiet affair in the family dining room, which felt too large for 3 people. The empty chairs were a reminder of better times when aunts and uncles and cousins had filled the house with noise and laughter and the comfortable chaos of family. Harrison Bancroft was distracted, speaking little, his gaze constantly drifting to Vivian, as though seeing her anew, calculating her worth in the marriage market with the cold precision of a merchant appraising goods. Vivian chatted about Boston, the modistes, the ladies she'd encountered while shopping. Her voice had that slightly performative quality it always carried at dinner, as though she were practicing for some larger stage, rehearsing lines for an audience that extended beyond the 3 of them. Eleanor ate quietly, contributed little to the conversation, and was not missed when she excused herself before dessert. She found her way back to the library, to her chair by the window, now dark with night. Someone had lit a single candle on the side table, probably Mrs. Patterson, who alone seemed to notice Eleanor's habits and needs. She opened Mill again, but could not focus on the philosophy. Her mind kept returning to the overheard conversation, to her father's desperate words, to the impossible weight now resting on Vivian's slender shoulders. Vivian must marry well. Not Eleanor. Never Eleanor. The thought had never even crossed Harrison Bancroft's mind, that his younger daughter might be of use in solving the family's crisis. She was simply too inconsequential, too easily forgotten, too thoroughly invisible. Eleanor had spent 22 years as a shadow in her own home, drifting through rooms without causing a ripple existing in the margins of her family's story. She loved them, loved her father, despite his blindness, loved Vivian, despite the complicated tangle of affection and envy that bound them together. But the loneliness of perpetual invisibility had carved a hollow space inside her that no amount of books could fill. The sound of hoofbeats on gravel drew her attention to the window, a messenger on horseback riding fast despite the darkness. She watched as he dismounted at the entrance, watched as a footman took an envelope from him, watched the urgency in their movements. Moments later, Vivian's delighted cry echoed through the manor. "Father, father, come quickly!" An invitation from Duke Nathaniel Marlowe himself. Eleanor remained in her library chair listening to the excited voices in the distance, knowing without being told that her name would be included on the invitation only as an afterthought, a necessary formality. Senator Harrison Bancroft and family are cordially invited to a political salon at Marlowe House. The trap was set, the game had begun, and Eleanor, as always, would watch from the shadows while her sister stepped into the light. She looked down at the book in her lap at Mill's careful reasoning about the nature of human understanding and dignity and felt the weight of a truth the philosopher had addressed but which she had never fully grasped until this moment. That understanding oneself, seeing one's own worth, meant nothing if the world had already decided you were invisible. The candle flickered in a draft casting dancing shadows across the page. Outside her library sanctuary, Bancroft Manor hummed with new energy, new hope. All of it centered on Vivian's golden beauty and the Duke who might save them all. And Eleanor, alone with her books and her thoughts, allowed herself one moment of selfish longing, wondering what it might feel like to be seen, truly seen, by someone who looked past the surface to the person beneath. Then she closed her book, extinguished her candle, and disappeared into the darkness of the manor's corridors, a ghost in her own home. The week that followed the Duke's invitation transformed Bancroft Manor into a theater of desperate preparation. Eleanor watched it unfold from her usual vantage point in the margins, observing the frenzy with the detached interest of someone watching a play in which they had no speaking role. Her father closeted himself with Vivian for hours each day, coaching her on the art of conversation, the subtle dance of society, courtship, the precise calibration of charm required to capture a duke's attention without appearing desperate. "You must be engaged but not forward," Harrison Bancroft instructed, pacing before his eldest daughter in his study while Eleanor passed unnoticed in the hallway beyond. "Interested but not desperate. You must laugh at his jests but not too loudly. You must display accomplishment but not appear showy. Everything depends on this, Vivian. Everything." Through the crack in the door, Eleanor could see Vivian sitting ramrod straight in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression perfectly composed. But Eleanor noticed what her father did not, the slight tremor in her sister's fingers, the tightness around her eyes, the way she held herself as though her spine might shatter if she relaxed even slightly. Vivian was terrified, and their father was too consumed by his own desperation to notice. The night before the salon, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old manor settle and creak around her. Moonlight filtered through her window, casting silver shadows across the floor. A soft knock at her door startled her upright. "Come in," she called, surprised. No one knocked at her door after dark. No one knocked at her door at all most days. Vivian entered, still in her dressing gown, her golden hair loose around her shoulders. In the moonlight, she looked younger, less polished, almost fragile. "I couldn't sleep," Vivian said, hovering near the door as though uncertain of her welcome. Eleanor set aside her covers and gestured to the chair beside her bed. "Sit with me." Vivian crossed the room and sank into the chair, drawing her knees up beneath her like a child seeking comfort. For a long moment, neither sister spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they'd never said to each other, all the truths they'd both learned to avoid. "Do you ever feel," Vivian began, her voice barely above a whisper, "like a thing rather than a person?" Eleanor's breath caught. It was the most honest question her sister had ever asked her. "Yes," Eleanor answered simply, "every day." Vivian looked at her, then really looked at her, and Eleanor saw something raw and desperate in her sister's eyes. For a heartbeat, the perfect mask slipped, and Eleanor glimpsed the person beneath the performance. But before Eleanor could reach out, before she could offer comfort or solidarity or anything at all, Vivian's expression shuddered. The mask slipped back into place. Beautiful, serene, untouchable. "I should let you sleep," Vivian said, rising abruptly. "Tomorrow will be important." "Vivian." Good night, Eleanor. She was gone before Eleanor could find the words to call her back, leaving only the faint scent of rosewater and the echo of a vulnerability too frightening to examine. Eleanor stared at the closed door for a long time before returning to bed, though the words swam meaninglessly before her eyes when she tried to read. Sleep, when it finally came, was troubled and thin. The morning of the salon dawned clear and bright, the kind of September day that made Newport famous: crisp air, brilliant sun, the Atlantic visible in the distance, like a sheet of hammered silver. Eleanor dressed in a gown of soft gray that had been made over from one of Vivian's cast-offs. It was simple, almost severe in its lack of ornamentation, designed to ensure she would blend seamlessly into the wallpaper of whatever gathering she attended. When she descended the stairs, she found her father in the entrance hall, already dressed in his finest suit, checking his pocket watch with nervous frequency. "Ah, Eleanor," he said, glancing at her briefly before returning his attention to the watch. "You're ready. Good. Where's Vivian? We cannot be late. The Duke values punctuality, they say." "I'm here, father." Vivian appeared at the top of the staircase, and even Eleanor had to catch her breath. Her sister wore a gown of palest blue silk that seemed to capture and reflect the morning light. Her golden hair was arranged in an elegant coiffure that must have taken her lady's maid hours to perfect. A simple strand of pearls, their mother's pearls, graced her throat. She looked like a princess from a fairy story. Perfect, untouchable, heartbreakingly beautiful, and utterly miserable beneath the performance. Eleanor saw it in the tightness of her sister's smile, in the way her hands gripped her reticule, just a shade too firmly, in the barely perceptible tremor that ran through her as she descended the stairs. Harrison Bancroft saw none of it. He saw only the perfect daughter, the golden solution to all his problems, the beautiful bait for his desperate trap. "Magnificent," he breathed. "Absolutely magnificent. Come, the carriage is waiting. We must not keep His Grace waiting." As they settled into the carriage, Vivian and their father on one bench, Eleanor tucked into the opposite corner where she could be easily forgotten, Harrison began his final instructions. "Remember everything we discussed, Vivian. Smile, but not too broadly. Engage him in conversation, but let him lead. Display your accomplishments, but with modesty. And Eleanor," he turned to his younger daughter as though suddenly remembering she existed, "you will be present as is proper, but you will not draw attention to yourself. This is Vivian's moment. Do you understand?" "Yes, father," Eleanor said quietly. "I understand perfectly. I am to be invisible, as always." The carriage rolled through the streets of Newport, past the grand cottages of America's wealthiest families, the Gilded Age mansions that crowned the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. Each one was more magnificent than the last monuments to wealth and power and the unassailable belief in one's own superiority. Marlowe House emerged from among them like a crown jewel. It was not the largest of the Newport estates, but it was perhaps the most elegant, a neoclassical masterpiece of white marble and soaring columns perfectly proportioned, every line speaking of restraint and refined taste. The grounds were immaculate gardens laid out in geometric precision, the late blooming roses making a last brilliant show before autumn's inevitable decline. "My God," Harrison Bancroft whispered as their carriage rolled up the circular drive. "The man's even wealthier than they say." Eleanor said nothing, but her heart had begun to beat faster. Because somewhere in that magnificent house was the Duke himself, the man her father intended to trap with Vivian's beauty, the man who represented their family's last desperate hope. The man who, according to all accounts, had spent 8 years in mourning for a wife he'd loved and lost, sealed away from society, impervious to the parade of beautiful women who tried to capture his attention. What made her father think Vivian would succeed where so many others had failed? The carriage stopped. A liveried footman opened the door. Harrison descended first, then handed Vivian down with the careful attention one might give to precious cargo. Eleanor descended last unassisted and stood slightly behind her sister as they approached the grand entrance. The doors opened before they could knock. "Senator Bancroft," the butler intoned. "Miss Vivian Bancroft, Miss Eleanor Bancroft. His Grace is expecting you in the East drawing room. The other guests have already arrived." They followed the butler through a marble entrance hall that would have comfortably housed Eleanor's entire bedroom 3 times over. Paintings lined the walls, not the stuffy ancestral portraits favored by most old families, but works by living artists, bold and modern and challenging. Eleanor glimpsed titles as they passed a portrait of a woman reading, her face illuminated by lamplight. A street scene of New York, vibrant and alive. An abstract study of light and shadow that seemed to shimmer as she moved past it. These were not the paintings of a man who lived in the past. These were the choices of someone engaged with the present, hungry for new ideas and new perspectives. The butler led them to a pair of double doors and opened them with practiced flourish. Senator Harrison Bancroft in the Mrs. Bancroft, he announced. The east drawing room was magnificent, soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden's walls lined with books rather than the expected gilt and damask. A gathering of perhaps 20 people stood in clusters, engaged in animated conversation. The energy in the room was different from the usual society, gathering less performance, more genuine engagement. These people were actually talking to each other, not just exchanging the ritualized pleasantries that pass for conversation in most drawing rooms. And there in the center of it all was the Duke himself. Duke Nathaniel Marlowe was not what Eleanor had expected. The society pages had described him. Of course, everyone knew the tragic story of the young Duke who'd lost his beloved wife to consumption, who'd retreated from the world, who'd finally emerged from mourning to seek a new companion. But no description had quite prepared her for the reality of the man. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair that was already silvering at the temples, despite being only 36 years old. His face was lean and angular, marked by a thin scar that traced from his left cheekbone to his jaw, the result Eleanor knew from gossip of an assassination attempt during a diplomatic mission 3 years prior. He wore his formal clothes with unconscious ease, but it was his eyes that arrested her attention. Deep brown, almost black, they carried the weight of grief and experience, but also an intelligence that seemed to take in everything, missing nothing. He was in the middle of a heated discussion with a group of 5 gentlemen when the butler announced their arrival. He glanced up, and for just a moment his eyes swept across the 3 of them. Eleanor felt that gaze touch her like a physical thing, and then it moved on. Her father was already moving forward, Vivian on his arm, approaching the Duke with the determination of a general advancing on an objective. Eleanor remained near the door, making herself small, invisible, as she'd been instructed. But her eyes could not help tracking the Duke as her father began his performance. "Your Grace," Harrison Bancroft's voice rose above the general conversation, drawing attention like an actor claiming center stage. "I cannot express what an honor it is to be invited to your home. May I have the privilege of presenting my daughter, the finest jewel in all of Newport, Miss Vivian Bancroft." Vivian curtsied with perfect grace, the movement fluid and practiced. When she rose, she offered the Duke a smile that had been calibrated to charm, warm, but not forward, interested, but not desperate. The Duke bowed a precise inclination of his head. "Miss Bancroft, welcome to Marlowe House. I hope you'll enjoy this afternoon's discussions." His voice was cultured, educated, with a slight rasp that suggested either a long night of conversation or the lingering effects of some old illness. The effect was oddly compelling. "I'm certain I shall, Your Grace," Vivian replied, her voice carrying just the right note of gracious interest. "Father tells me you're an advocate for women's suffrage. How progressive." "It's not progressive to believe women are human beings deserving of full participation in democracy, Miss Bancroft. It's simply logical." The words were mild, but Eleanor detected an edge to them, a test perhaps, or a challenge. Vivian's smile never wavered, but Eleanor saw her sister's fingers tighten slightly on her reticule. "Of course, Your Grace. I only meant that many men of your station hold more traditional views." "Then many men of my station are fools," the Duke replied. His tone was not unkind, but neither was it the warm engagement one might expect in a man who'd invited a beautiful woman to his home with matrimonial intentions. Harrison Bancroft cleared his throat, clearly sensing the conversation veering off script. "Your Grace, Vivian is an accomplished pianist. Perhaps later she might favor us with a performance." "Perhaps," the Duke said, "though I confess I invited guests today more for their conversation than their accomplishments. I find musical performances rather inhibit debate, don't you?" It was a polite dismissal delivered with such perfect courtesy that Harrison could do nothing but smile and nod. But Eleanor saw her father's jaws tighten, saw the flash of desperation in his eyes. The Duke's attention had already shifted. His gaze moved past Vivian, past Harrison, and landed on Eleanor, still standing near the door. "And you must be the other Miss Bancroft," he said, addressing her directly for the first time. Eleanor felt every eye in the room turned toward her. The weight of attention was crushing. She was used to being invisible, overlooked, forgotten. Being seen, truly seen by a room full of society's elite was like being suddenly thrust into blinding sunlight after years in shadow. "Yes, Your Grace," she managed. "Eleanor Bancroft." She curtsied less gracefully than Vivian, but adequately. The Duke studied her for a moment, and Eleanor had the unsettling sensation of being actually observed, assessed, seen as an individual, rather than merely a younger sister to be acknowledged and dismissed. "Miss Eleanor," he said, "I'm pleased you could join us. Your father mentioned in his response that you have an interest in political philosophy. Is that accurate? Eleanor's heart stuttered. Her father had mentioned her. That seemed unlikely. Perhaps the Duke was being polite, crediting Harrison with a consideration he'd never actually shown. I, yes, Your Grace, I enjoy reading philosophy and politics. Excellent. Then you'll add substance to our discussions. Please make yourself comfortable. We were just debating the merits of Mill's arguments in The Subjection of Women. Are you familiar with the work? Was she familiar with it? She'd read it 4 times. She could quote entire passages from memory. It was one of the few books that made her feel seen, understood, validated in her quiet rebellions against the world's expectations. I am familiar with it, yes, she said carefully. Splendid. We'll continue the discussion after refreshments. There are books along that wall if you'd like to peruse while we finish our current debate. It was an invitation, she realized. Not a dismissal, but actual inclusion. The Duke was inviting her to engage with his library, to be part of the intellectual gathering, to exist as more than a decorative afterthought. Eleanor moved toward the wall of books as if in a dream, barely aware of her father's perplexed expression or Vivian's careful mask of polite interest. The other guests had already returned to their conversations, accepting her presence without particular interest. She was invisible again, but in a different way now. Not dismissed, but simply allowed to exist. The wall of books was magnificent. She ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles with growing excitement. Here was Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman and Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Rousseau's The Social Contract, Locke's 2 treatises of government, Voltaire, Hume, Adam Smith, Thomas Paine. This was not a decorative library assembled for show. These books had been read, argued with, understood. Many had annotations visible, even from the spines, small slips of paper marking important passages. Her hand stopped on a slim blue volume tucked between larger works, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She pulled it from the shelf carefully, as one might handle something precious and rare. The book fell open to a well-worn page, and Eleanor found herself reading a passage she'd memorized years ago. I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. Bold choice for a salon. The voice came from directly beside her, low and cultured, and tinged with something that might have been amusement. Eleanor's head snapped up, the book nearly slipping from her hands. Duke Nathaniel Marlowe stood not 3 feet away, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Up close, he was even more formidable, taller, broader-shouldered, carrying himself with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. But his eyes held no arrogance, only intelligence and something that might have been curiosity. Your Grace, Eleanor stammered, feeling heat flood her cheeks. I apologize. I shouldn't have presumed. Why not? He interrupted gently. The books are here to be read, not merely displayed. Have you read Wollstonecraft? Eleanor hesitated. This felt like a test, though she couldn't determine what the correct answer might be. Tell the truth, she decided. She'd spent too much of her life performing, pretending, making herself small and acceptable. Yes, she said, twice. What did you think? The question was genuine. His attention was fully focused on her in a way that made her feel simultaneously exposed and exhilarated. I think, Eleanor paused, gathering her thoughts, feeling herself slip into the familiar comfort of ideas rather than awkward social performance. I think she argues persuasively that denying women education does not protect their virtue, but rather ensures their dependence. That treating women as decorative objects rather than thinking beings diminishes both the women themselves and the society that constrains them. Something shifted in the Duke's expression. The polite interest became something sharper, more engaged. He leaned slightly forward, and Eleanor was reminded of a scholar discovering an unexpected insight in a familiar text. You disagree with her critics, then? He asked. Those who claim she advocates for unwomanly behavior. Her critics confuse independence with impropriety, Eleanor said, warming to the subject despite her nervousness. They cannot imagine a woman who thinks and remains virtuous, as though the two qualities were somehow incompatible. But surely virtue grounded in genuine understanding is stronger than virtue maintained through ignorance. For the first time since she'd observed him that evening, the Duke smiled, not the polite expression he'd worn while greeting her father and Vivian, but something genuine, reaching his eyes and softening the grief-carved lines of his face. Catherine used to carry that very volume, he said quietly. My late wife. She would quote passages at dinner parties, much to the horror of the more conventional guests. Eleanor felt a pang of something, sympathy perhaps, or recognition. Everyone knew the story of Duke Marlowe's wife, the beautiful Lady Caroline, who died of consumption 8 years ago, leaving her young husband devastated. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. "I didn't mean to bring up painful memories. Please don't apologize." The Duke's voice was firm but not unkind. "It's been 8 years since anyone spoke to me about ideas rather than offering condolences or tiptoeing around Caroline's memory. I find I've missed it." He paused, studying her with that same intent focus. "Your father mentioned you read widely. What else occupies your library?" And just like that, they were deep in conversation. Not the ritualized exchange of pleasantries that passed for discourse in most drawing rooms, but actual engagement. Eleanor found herself discussing Kant and Rousseau, defending positions she'd developed over years of solitary reading, challenging assumptions, building arguments. The Duke countered her points with his own citing sources she hadn't considered, offering perspectives that made her reconsider positions she'd thought settled. Time disappeared. The rest of the room faded. There was only the exchange of ideas, the thrill of being genuinely understood, the rare pleasure of intellectual combat with a worthy opponent. Eleanor had never felt so alive. She didn't notice her father approaching until his voice cut through their discussion like a knife. "Your Grace, forgive me for interrupting." Eleanor stepped back instinctively, the spell broken. She saw her father's expression hovering between confusion and alarm and understood immediately what he was thinking. This wasn't the script. The Duke was supposed to be enchanted by Vivian, not engaged in philosophical debate with the forgettable younger daughter. "Not at all, Senator," the Duke said, though his tone had cooled several degrees. "Your daughter and I were discussing Mill's arguments regarding the education of women." "How fascinating." Harrison's smile was strained. "Though I fear we may be monopolizing your attention, Your Grace. Surely there are other guests who would benefit from conversation with you." It was a dismissal, politely worded but unmistakable. Eleanor felt the familiar shame creep up her neck. Of course, she'd overstepped, drawn attention to herself when she was supposed to remain invisible, a decorative backdrop to Vivian's performance. But the Duke's response surprised her. "On the contrary, Senator, I find conversations about substantive matters far more valuable than the usual social pleasantries. Your daughter has a remarkable mind. You must be very proud." Harrison Bancroft's expression froze. Proud. Of Eleanor. The concept seemed foreign to him, as though the Duke had begun speaking in an unknown language. Yes, of course," he managed. "Though perhaps, Your Grace, you might enjoy hearing Vivian's thoughts on the matter as well. She's quite well read herself." He gestured to Vivian, who had been standing slightly behind him, observing the exchange with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. "Miss Vivian," the Duke said, turning to her with perfect courtesy, "please join us. We were discussing whether reason alone can guide moral philosophy or whether compassion must temper judgment. I'd value your perspective." Vivian stepped forward, her perfect smile in place, but Eleanor saw the slight widening of her eyes, the flicker of panic that came from being asked to engage in a discussion for which she had no prepared answers. I'm certain both have their place." "Your Grace," Vivian said carefully, "one must be reasonable, of course, but also kind." It was a safe answer, diplomatic and unobjectionable, also utterly devoid of substance. The Duke nodded politely. "Indeed. And how would you balance the two when they come into conflict, when reason suggests one course of action, but compassion another?" Vivian's smile remained fixed, but Eleanor saw her sister's hands tighten on her reticule. This was not the conversation their father had prepared her for. This required actual engagement, actual thought, actual opinions, rather than the carefully rehearsed pleasantries that pass for female accomplishment in most society gatherings. "I suppose," Vivian said slowly, "that one must trust one's heart in such moments." "An interesting perspective," the Duke said. His tone gave away nothing, neither approval nor disappointment. "Miss Eleanor, you looked as though you were about to counter my point about Kant's categorical imperative. Please continue." And just like that, his attention returned to Eleanor, leaving Vivian standing beside them like a beautiful statue that had failed to come to life. Eleanor glanced at her father, saw the fury building behind his eyes, and made a decision. She could retreat, make herself invisible again, play the role she'd been assigned. Let Vivian have this chance, this opportunity, this potential salvation for their family. Or she could be honest, be herself, for once in her invisible life, be seen. "I think," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength, "that Kant's argument fails to account for context. Pure reason, divorced from human experience, becomes tyranny. But compassion without reason becomes chaos. We need both reason to guide us toward justice and compassion to remind us why justice matters." The Duke's eyes lit with something that looked remarkably like delight. Precisely, he said. That's exactly the synthesis I've been trying to articulate. Reason and compassion aren't opposed, they're complementary, each necessary to temper the excesses of the other. They were off again building arguments together, challenging and supporting each other's positions. And Eleanor, for the first time in her 22 years, forgot to be invisible. She forgot to be ashamed of her intelligence, her reading, her unfeminine interest in philosophy and politics. She forgot to make herself small and acceptable and easily overlooked. She simply existed fully and completely in the joy of intellectual communion with someone who valued her mind. It was the most dangerous thing she'd ever done, because somewhere in the midst of that conversation, Eleanor Bancroft began to hope. And hope for someone who'd spent her life invisible was the most terrifying thing of all. The carriage ride back to Bancroft Manor was suffocating in its silence. Eleanor sat in her corner, hands folded in her lap, watching the Newport estates roll past in the golden afternoon light. Beside her, Vivian stared out the opposite window, her perfect profile revealing nothing. Their father sat across from them, his jaw working as though chewing words too bitter to speak aloud. The silence held until they were half a mile from home. Then Harrison Bancroft could contain himself no longer. "What?" he said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Did you think you were doing—" Eleanor looked up. "Father, don't play innocent with me, Eleanor. You monopolized the Duke's attention for 40 minutes. 40 minutes that should have been spent with Vivian, allowing her to make the impression. We need the impression that will save this family from ruin." "I didn't monopolize anything," Eleanor said quietly. "His Grace asked me questions. I answered them. That's all." "That's all." Harrison's face was reddening, the veins at his temples standing out like cords. "You paraded your learning like some kind of blue-stocking suffragette, making a spectacle of yourself, drawing attention away from your sister, who is our only hope." Perhaps Vivian's voice cut through their father's tirade, cool and measured. The Duke preferred Eleanor's company because she was being genuine rather than performing. Both Eleanor and Harrison turned to stare at her. Vivian was still looking out the window, her expression serene, but Eleanor detected something underneath, something hard and sharp as broken glass. "Vivian," Harrison said, his tone shifting to conciliatory, almost desperate. "You must understand, everything depends on this, on you, on capturing the Duke's interest in securing an engagement. We have 4 months before we lose everything." "I understand perfectly, Father," Vivian said, finally turning to look at him. "You need me to sell myself to the wealthiest bidder, like a prized horse at auction. I understand completely. That's not what I mean." "Isn't it?" For the first time, Eleanor heard real bitterness in her sister's voice. "You've been preparing me for this my entire life. How to sit, how to smile, how to be decorative and charming and utterly devoid of any opinion that might disturb a gentleman's digestion. I've been very well trained." "Vivian, please." But apparently, Vivian continued as though their father hadn't spoken. "Duke Marlowe prefers substance to performance. How inconvenient for your plans." The carriage pulled up to Bancroft Manor before Harrison could respond. Vivian descended without waiting for assistance, gathering her skirts and disappearing into the house, with her spine rigid and her head high. Eleanor moved to follow, but her father's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "This is not over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Tomorrow morning, my study. We will discuss your behavior and what will be expected of you going forward." He released her wrist and stalked toward the house, leaving Eleanor standing alone beside the carriage in the lengthening shadows. She rubbed her wrist absently, though he hadn't gripped hard enough to hurt. The physical touch was nothing. It was the threat in his voice that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "What will be expected of you going forward?" She knew what that meant. Invisibility. Silence. The erasure of the self she'd been allowed to be briefly, gloriously in Duke Marlowe's library. Eleanor looked up at the manor, at the windows glowing warm against the gathering dusk, and made a decision that would change everything. She would not be invisible anymore. Sleep eluded Eleanor that night. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the afternoon. The Duke's questions, her answers, the way his eyes had lit up when she challenged his arguments, the feeling of being seen, truly seen, not as a younger sister or a disappointing daughter, but as a mind worth engaging. "Your daughter has a remarkable mind. You must be very proud." Her father wasn't proud. He was furious. Because Eleanor's mind wasn't useful to him, wasn't the currency he needed to pay their debts. Only Vivian's beauty had value in his desperate calculations. A soft knock at her door startled her upright. The clock on her mantel showed midnight. "Come in," she called softly. Vivian slipped through the door, closing it carefully behind her. She still wore her dressing gown, her golden hair loose around her shoulders. In the moonlight streaming through Eleanor's window, she looked ethereal, almost ghostly. I saw your light, Vivian said, moving to sit on the edge of Eleanor's bed. You can't sleep either. No. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Vivian spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something. A secret I've kept for 3 years. Eleanor waited, her heart beginning to pound. Do you remember Colonel Thaddeus Ashford? The name stirred a memory, a young cavalry officer recently commissioned who'd attended several society events 3 summers ago. Handsome, charming, but without fortune or title. The second son of a minor family from Virginia. I remember him, Eleanor said carefully. I loved him. Vivian's voice cracked on the word. I still love him. We wanted to marry, but father forbade it. Thaddeus had nothing to offer but his officer's pay and a posting to some godforsaken fort in Wyoming. Father said I would throw my life away, waste my beauty, on a man who could never support me in the manner I deserved. Vivian. Thaddeus left for Fort Laramie 3 years ago. We wrote for a while, but father found the letters and destroyed them. Told me to forget him, to focus on finding a suitable match. Someone wealthy, someone who could save us. Tears were sliding down Vivian's perfect face, now catching the moonlight like diamonds. I've been dying slowly ever since, she whispered. Every ball, every suitor, every performance of being the perfect daughter, it's been a kind of living death. And now father wants me to marry the Duke, and I can't. I can't do it, Eleanor, not even to save us. Eleanor reached for her sister's hand, gripping it tightly. Then don't. But the debts are not your burden to carry. Not by selling yourself to a man you don't love. Vivian looked at her, tears still streaming. But what about you? What about the conversation with the Duke? I saw the way he looked at you, Ellie. The way you came alive when you spoke with him. You should have that. You deserve that. I don't know what I deserve, Eleanor said honestly, but I know you deserve more than a marriage of desperation. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I wrote to Thaddeus 2 weeks ago. Told him everything, father's debts, the pressure to marry, how I never stopped loving him. I sent it to his posting at Fort Laramie. Did he respond? Not yet, but Wyoming is 6 weeks by post, and he may have been transferred. I don't even know if he received it or if he still... Her voice trailed off. Still loves you. Vivian nodded, fresh tears welling. Eleanor squeezed her sister's hand. Then we buy time. I'll keep Duke Marlowe's attention if I can. Not to trap him, but to keep father's focus off forcing you into an immediate engagement. And we'll hope Thaddeus writes back. But what about you, Vivian asked. What if you fall in love with the Duke? What if this becomes real for you? Eleanor thought of the afternoon, of the intellectual electricity she'd felt, of the dangerous, terrifying hope that had taken root in her chest. Then I'll deal with that when it happens, she said. Right now we help each other. We're sisters. We're supposed to be allies, not rivals. Vivian threw her arms around Eleanor, holding her tight. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do, Eleanor said softly. We both deserve better than what father has planned for us. They held each other in the moonlight, two women trapped in a world that saw them only as commodities to be traded, finding strength in the only thing they truly had, each other. Morning came too soon and too bright. Eleanor dressed carefully in a simple day dress of pale blue, steeling herself for the confrontation with her father. The summons to his study came before she'd even finished breakfast. She knocked on the heavy oak door, her heart hammering. Enter. Harrison Bancroft sat behind his desk, looking as though he hadn't slept. Papers were scattered across the surface, bills, notices from creditors, letters bearing the seals of banks, the physical evidence of their impending ruin. Sit, he said, not looking up. Eleanor sat in the chair across from him, folding her hands in her lap, calling on every ounce of composure she possessed. I've been thinking about yesterday, Harrison said, finally meeting her eyes, about your behavior at the Duke's salon. Eleanor said nothing, waiting. You embarrassed yourself. And more importantly, you embarrassed Vivian by drawing attention away from her at a critical moment. Father the Duke asked me direct questions. What was I supposed to do? Refuse to answer. You were supposed to deflect, to be modest and demure and redirect his attention to your sister as any properly raised young woman would do. His voice was rising now, taking on the edge that had once cowed political opponents. Instead, you showed off your learning like some blue-stocking reformer making a spectacle of yourself. Eleanor felt something inside her crack. 22 years of being invisible, of being dismissed, of being told implicitly and explicitly that she was less valuable than her beautiful sister. 22 years of swallowing her thoughts and her opinions and her very self to be acceptable. And yesterday, for 40 precious minutes, she had been free. No, she said quietly. Harrison's head snapped up. What did you say? I said no. Eleanor's voice was stronger now, fueled by something she'd never allowed herself to feel before: anger. I will not apologize for being intelligent. I will not apologize for having opinions. And I will not make myself invisible just because my existence inconveniences your plans. Eleanor, you asked the Duke to your home, hoping he'd notice Vivian. He noticed me instead. That's not my fault. That's not something I engineered or manipulated. I was simply myself. Perhaps that's what was novel. Harrison's face was turning purple. You ungrateful. Do you have any idea what's at stake? We are 4 months from complete ruin. 4 months from losing this house, this name, everything, and our only hope is for Vivian to make an advantageous match. Then perhaps you should have managed your finances better. Eleanor shot back, surprising herself with her vehemence. Perhaps you should have lived within your means instead of gambling on political favors and bad investments. This disaster is your creation, Father. Not mine, not Vivian's, yours. The slap came so fast she didn't see it coming. One moment she was sitting upright in her chair, and the next her head had snapped to the side, her cheek burning. They both froze. Harrison stared at his own hand as though it belonged to a stranger. Eleanor touched her cheek, feeling the heat of the mark. Eleanor, Harrison said, his voice suddenly hollow. I didn't mean... Yes, you did. Eleanor stood, her legs somehow steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. You meant it, because I stepped out of line. Because I refused to be invisible on command. She walked to the door, then turned back. Duke Marlowe is coming to call this afternoon. He sent a note this morning. He specifically requested to continue his conversation with me. Not Vivian, me. You can try to prevent that if you wish. But know that if you do, you'll lose any chance of securing him for this family. Because he's not interested in Vivian. He never was. She left before he could respond, closing the door behind her with careful precision. Only then did she allow herself to lean against the wall in the corridor, her whole body shaking. She justified her father. Openly, for the first time in her life. And it was terrifying and exhilarating. And there was no going back now. The Duke arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, as his note had promised. Eleanor watched from the upstairs window as his carriage pulled up to Bancroft Manor, an elegant equipage drawn by matched bays, the Marlowe crest emblazoned on the door. Her father had spent the morning in his study, emerging only to give terse instructions to Mrs. Patterson about the afternoon's arrangements. He hadn't spoken to Eleanor again, hadn't even looked at her. The mark on her cheek had faded, but she could still feel the ghost of it, a reminder of how far she'd pushed. Now as the Duke descended from his carriage, Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. What was she doing? This was madness. She was setting herself up for a fall that would shatter her completely. But the alternative, retreating back into invisibility, watching Vivian be sacrificed on the altar of their father's desperation, was unthinkable. The door to her room opened without a knock. Vivian swept in, already dressed for receiving callers in a gown of palest pink that made her look like a rose in full bloom. He's here, Vivian said unnecessarily. I know. Eleanor, are you sure about this? Father is furious. And if the Duke truly does prefer your company, if this becomes real... She trailed off, her expression troubled. I don't know if it's real, Eleanor admitted. Maybe he just enjoys debating with someone who's actually read the books. Maybe tomorrow he'll remember I'm plain and forgettable, and that will be the end of it. You're not plain, Vivian said fiercely. You're brilliant and brave and infinitely more interesting than I could ever pretend to be. You're not pretending anymore, remember? Eleanor managed a smile. We're both being ourselves now. Come what may. They descended the stairs together side by side, and Eleanor felt a sudden rush of gratitude for her sister. Whatever else happened, they had each other. They were allies now, not rivals in their father's desperate games. Harrison was already in the drawing room when they entered, standing by the fireplace with the rigid posture of a man preparing for battle. His eyes flickered to Eleanor, to the faint mark still visible on her cheek if one looked closely, and something like shame crossed his face before his expression hardened again. The butler appeared in the doorway. His Grace, the Duke of Marlowe. Duke Nathaniel Marlowe entered the room with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being the most important person present. He was dressed less formally than yesterday, a simple suit of dark gray that somehow made him look more formidable rather than less. His eyes swept the room, acknowledging Harrison with a polite nod, offering Vivian a courteous bow, and finally landing on Eleanor. Something in his expression shifted, warmed. "Senator Bancroft," he said, turning to her father, "thank you for receiving me on such short notice. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Your Grace." Harrison managed his voice, straining for the hearty warmth of political bonhomie. "We're honored by your visit. Please sit. May we offer you refreshment?" "Thank you, no, I won't keep you long. I came because I wanted to continue a discussion from yesterday." He turned deliberately to Eleanor. "Miss Eleanor, you mentioned you'd read Voltaire. I've been rereading his treatise on tolerance and would value your thoughts." The room seemed to hold its breath. Harrison's face went through several fascinating transformations. Eleanor could almost see him, calculating the Duke was here, was engaging with his family, was showing interest. That was good, but he was showing interest in the wrong daughter. That was catastrophic. "I'm certain Eleanor would be delighted to discuss Voltaire," Harrison said, his smile frozen in place. "Though I'm sure Vivian has read the work as well. Haven't you, my dear?" Vivian, bless her, didn't even try to pretend. "I'm afraid not, Father. Philosophy has never been my strength, but Eleanor could discuss Voltaire for hours." The Duke's lips quirked in something that might have been amusement. "Then perhaps we might take a turn in your gardens. The weather is remarkably fine, and I find fresh air conducive to philosophical discussion." It was an unusual request, not improper exactly, as Vivian could certainly accompany them as chaperone, but neither was it the standard protocol for a formal call. Harrison's jaw worked. "Of course, Your Grace. Though perhaps Vivian should join you. It wouldn't be proper for Eleanor to walk alone with—" "I was hoping both Miss Bancroft and Miss Eleanor would join me," the Duke said smoothly. "If that would be agreeable." What could Harrison say? One didn't refuse a Duke's request, especially not the Duke one hoped would solve all one's financial problems. "Of course," he said again, the words sounding strangled. "Of course, girls, fetch your wraps." The Bancroft Gardens were modest compared to the grandeur of Marlowe House, but they had a wild charm that Eleanor had always loved. Roses climbed over arbors, creating secret spaces. Gravel paths wound between overgrown flower beds. It was the garden of a family that had once had money for groundskeepers and no longer did. The three of them walked in silence for a moment, Vivian keeping a proper distance behind a chaperone. The Duke offered Eleanor his arm, and she took it, trying to ignore the flutter of nerves in her stomach at the contact even through layers of fabric. "You have a mark on your cheek," the Duke said quietly once they were out of earshot of the house. Eleanor's hand flew to her face instinctively. "It's nothing. I walked into a door." The Duke stopped walking and turned to face her directly. His eyes were grave, penetrating. "Miss Eleanor, I've spent considerable time negotiating treaties and managing diplomatic crises. I've become rather good at detecting lies. You didn't walk into a door." Eleanor felt her cheeks flame. Behind them, Vivian had diplomatically wandered toward a rosebush, giving them a moment of relative privacy. "It's a family matter, Your Grace. Nothing that need concern you. If someone struck you, it concerns me greatly." The words were quiet but carried an edge of steel that made Eleanor look up sharply. The Duke's expression had shifted, the intellectual curiosity replaced by something harder, more protective. "Your Grace, I appreciate your concern, but truly it's not— Did your father hit you because of our conversation yesterday?" The directness of the question stole Eleanor's breath. She'd never met a man who spoke so plainly, who cut through social niceties to the heart of the uncomfortable truths. "He was upset," she admitted. "I drew attention from Vivian when I was supposed to remain in the background. He felt I'd overstepped. By having opinions, by being intelligent, by being visible." The words hung in the air between them. The Duke's expression darkened. "Miss Eleanor, I'm going to be equally direct with you. May I?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I knew about your family's financial situation before I invited you to my salon. I make it my business to know about anyone I might potentially associate with." Eleanor felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "You knew about the debts?" "Yes." "About your father's desperation to marry off your sister to save the family from ruin?" "Yes." He paused. "About you? No, you were a complete surprise." "I don't understand." "I invited your family because I'd heard Miss Vivian was accomplished and beautiful and everything a duke is supposed to want in a wife. I thought perhaps I was ready to remarry to fulfill that duty, to find someone suitable and build a pleasant, if not passionate, partnership." He took a breath, and Eleanor saw something vulnerable flicker across his face. "Then I met you, and you argued with me about Wollstonecraft. You challenged my interpretation of Mill. You built a synthesis of Kant that I'd been struggling toward for months, and I remembered what it felt like to be genuinely engaged with another mind. Your Grace. My wife Caroline died 8 years ago, he continued. We were married only 3 years, but they were the best years of my life. She was brilliant and fierce and utterly herself. When she died, I thought that part of me died too. The part that could connect, that could feel, that could experience an intellectual communion with another person. He stepped closer, and Eleanor found she couldn't look away from his eyes. Yesterday, for 40 minutes, I felt alive again. Not because you reminded me of Caroline, you don't, not in any physical way, but because you're real Eleanor, genuinely, authentically yourself. And that is rarer than you can possibly imagine in the world we inhabit. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. I'm not, I'm not beautiful. I'm not charming. I will embarrass you at dinners and balls. People will say you made a poor choice, that grief has clouded your judgment. People say a great many foolish things, the Duke said. I stopped caring about their opinions years ago. But I'm plain, forgettable, invisible. He reached out and with infinite gentleness tilted her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. Eleanor, you are the least invisible person I've met in 8 years. When you speak, I listen. When you argue, I engage. When you're in a room, I'm aware of you down to my bones. That's not invisibility. That's presence. That's substance. I don't know what to do with this, Eleanor whispered. I don't know how to want something this much without being terrified of losing it. Then be terrified, be uncertain, be yourself. That's all I ask. They stood frozen in that moment, the garden around them fading to impressions of green and gold, the late afternoon sun gilding everything with precious light. Behind them, Vivian cleared her throat delicately. I hate to interrupt, she called, not sounding sorry at all, but Father is watching from the study window, and he looks rather intense. The Duke stepped back, creating proper distance, but his eyes never left Eleanor's face. I would like to call on you again, he said. Tomorrow, if you'll permit it, to continue our discussion. Our discussion of Voltaire, among other things. A smile tugged at his lips. I find there are a great many things I want to discuss with you, Eleanor Bancroft. She should demur, should redirect to Vivian, should do any of the thousand things a proper young woman was supposed to do when a Duke showed interest and it wasn't the Duke's intended target. Instead, she said, I'd like that very much. They walked back to the house in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, charged with possibility, heavy with unspoken words, electric with the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but both were powerless to stop. Harrison met them at the door, his expression a study in conflicting emotions. He wanted to rage at Eleanor. She could see it in his eyes. But the Duke was there, was still engaged, was still showing interest. Your Grace, Harrison said, will you stay for tea? We'd be honored. Thank you, but I must return to town. I have business to attend to this evening. The Duke turned to Eleanor, bowing over her hand. Miss Eleanor, thank you for the stimulating conversation. I look forward to continuing it tomorrow. Your Grace? He acknowledged Vivian with equal courtesy, nodded to Harrison, and was gone, leaving the Bancrofts standing in the entrance hall in various states of bewilderment. Harrison rounded on Eleanor the moment the Duke's carriage was out of sight. What did you say to him? What did you do? We talked about Voltaire, Eleanor said truthfully. And other things. What other things? Philosophy, politics, ideas that matter. She met her father's eyes steadily. Things that interest us both. This is impossible, Harrison muttered, beginning to pace. He should be courting Vivian. She's the one who's beautiful, Eleanor supplied. Yes, we know, but apparently His Grace values more than surface beauty. This isn't a game, Eleanor. Our entire future depends on Vivian marrying the Duke. Yes, I know. You've made that abundantly clear. Eleanor felt the anger from that morning returning. But what if Vivian doesn't want to marry him? What if she wants to choose for herself? Want, Harrison's voice rose. This isn't about what anyone wants. This is about survival. No, Eleanor said quietly. This is about you refusing to face the consequences of your own poor decisions. And now you want to sell your daughters to save yourself. The second slap never came, though. Harrison's hand twitched. Perhaps because Vivian was standing right there watching. Perhaps because even Harrison Bancroft had some limit to his violence. Get out of my sight, he said instead, his voice shaking. Both of you, now. Eleanor and Vivian retreated up the stairs together, not speaking until they reached Eleanor's room. Only then did Vivian close the door and lean against it, her perfect composure finally cracking. He asked about me, didn't he? Vivian said. The Duke, he asked if I wanted to marry him. Not in so many words, But yes, he's aware father is pushing you toward him. He knows about the debts. Vivian closed her eyes. And he doesn't want me. He wants you. I don't know what he wants, Eleanor said honestly, but he enjoys talking to me. That's all I'm certain of. That's not all, Ellie. I saw how he looked at you in the garden. That wasn't just intellectual interest. That was, she trailed off, was what? The way I wish someone would look at me, like I matter, like I'm more than just a pretty face. Eleanor crossed to her sister, taking her hands. You are more than a pretty face. You always have been. But you've been trained to hide everything else, to be decorative and charming and empty. Oma, it's not your fault. I don't know how to be anything else. Then learn. Be yourself, for Thaddeus, if not for yourself. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. What if he doesn't write back? What if he's forgotten me? Then we face that when it happens. But until then, we hope. We hope and we resist Father's plans, and we help each other survive. They held each other as the afternoon light faded to evening, two sisters who'd spent their lives on opposite sides of an invisible divide, finally finding common ground in rebellion. The Duke came the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each visit followed the same pattern. He would arrive with perfect propriety, acknowledge Harrison and Vivian with courteous formality, and then request time to speak with Eleanor. They talked about philosophy and politics. They debated treaty law and international relations. They discussed books and ideas and the problems facing America in this new Gilded Age. The Duke told her about his work advising the State Department about the assassination attempt that had left the scar on his face, about the negotiations he'd conducted that prevented war. Eleanor told him about her isolated education, about reading in secret when she was supposed to be learning embroidery, about the loneliness of being intelligent in a world that valued beauty over substance. With each conversation, Eleanor felt herself unfurling like a flower that had been pressed between the pages of a book, finally exposed to sunlight and air. With each visit, the Duke seemed to shed layers of the grief that had armored him for 8 years. They were healing each other, Eleanor realized, finding in each other something that had been missing: partnership, intellectual equality, the rare gift of being truly understood. Harrison watched these visits with growing desperation. He couldn't forbid them, one didn't forbid a Duke. But his fury at Eleanor grew with each passing day, manifesting in cold silences and cutting remarks delivered when the Duke wasn't present. Vivian watched with something like wonder and perhaps a touch of envy, not for the Duke himself, but for the connection Eleanor had found. The evidence that such partnerships could exist even in their constrained world. 2 weeks after that first salon, everything changed. The Duke arrived earlier than usual at noon rather than his customary 3 o'clock. Harrison was out meeting with creditors. Vivian was in the music room practicing piano. Only Eleanor was in the drawing room when he was announced. She looked up from her book to find the Duke standing in the doorway, and something in his expression made her heart stutter. "Your Grace," she said, rising, "I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon." "I couldn't wait." He crossed to her in 3 long strides. "Eleanor, I need to speak with you, privately." "That's not proper. I should call for Vivian." "Please, just for a moment." There was an urgency in his voice she'd never heard before. Eleanor nodded, her pulse racing. The Duke took a breath, and she saw that his hands were trembling slightly. This man who'd negotiated treaties, who'd survived assassination attempts, who faced down hostile governments, he was nervous. "2 weeks ago," he began, "I came to your father's salon expecting to feel nothing, to perform the duty of finding a suitable wife, building a pleasant, if passionless, partnership, creating an heir, fulfilling obligations." Eleanor couldn't breathe. "Instead, I found you, and you reminded me what it feels like to be alive. Not just existing, going through motions, but actually engaged with the world, with another person, with possibility." He stepped closer, close enough that Eleanor could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. "I've spent 8 years in a tomb of my own making," he said. Grief became comfortable. Numbness became safe. "I told myself I was honoring Caroline's memory by refusing to feel anything for anyone else." "Your Grace." "Nathaniel," he said softly. "When we're alone, please call me Nathaniel." "Nathaniel," Eleanor whispered, testing the name on her tongue. "Eleanor, I'm not good at this. I'm out of practice, and I was never particularly eloquent about feelings, even when Caroline was alive. But I need you to know." He paused, gathering courage. "These past 2 weeks have been the happiest I've been since she died. And it's because of you. Because of your mind, your honesty, your courage to be yourself in a world that punishes women for having substance." "I'm terrified," Eleanor admitted, "of this, of you, of wanting something this much." "So am I." He reached for her hand and she let him take it. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe and alone. My father wants me to direct your attention to Vivian. He's furious that you keep choosing me instead. I know, and I need you to understand I'm not courting you to spite your father or to be contrary. I'm courting you because I can't help myself. Because when I'm with you, I remember what joy feels like. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I've been invisible my whole life, and now you're asking me to step into the light to be seen to matter. That's the most terrifying thing anyone's ever asked of me. I know, Nathaniel said gently. But Eleanor, you were never invisible. You were just waiting for the right eyes. And I see you completely. They stood like that, hands joined the space between them, charged with possibility and fear, and the beginning of something neither could name, but both recognized. The sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Nathaniel stepped back, restoring proper distance, but his eyes never left Eleanor's face. I'm hosting a dinner, he said quietly, a week from today. Political figures, reformers, intellectuals. I'd like you to attend, both you and Vivian with your father as chaperone. A dinner where you can be yourself, where your mind will be valued, where you can shine. He paused. I want to show you what your life could be, Eleanor, if you choose it. Harrison's voice echoed from the entrance hall, speaking to Mrs. Patterson. I should go, Nathaniel said, but think about what I've said, please. He bowed over her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that was barely proper but sent electricity racing up her arm. Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor standing in the drawing room, her hand still tingling from his touch, her heart racing with terror and hope in equal measure. Harrison appeared in the doorway moments later, his expression thunderous. What did he want? To invite us to dinner, Eleanor said, proud that her voice remained steady. A week from today. All of us. Yes, a political dinner. Reformers and intellectuals, he said. Harrison's expression shifted, calculation replacing anger. A dinner at Marlowe House. An opportunity. Perhaps not the opportunity he'd planned, but an opportunity nonetheless. We'll attend, he said, all of us. And Eleanor, he fixed her with a hard stare. You will be on your best behavior. No showing off, no monopolizing the Duke's attention. Is that understood? Eleanor met her father's eyes without flinching. I understand what you want, Father. Whether I'll comply is another matter entirely. She left him standing in the drawing room, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, too shocked by her defiance to form words. Upstairs, she found Vivian waiting in her room. He proposed, didn't he? Vivian asked. Not yet, but I think he's going to. And will you say yes? Eleanor sank onto her bed, suddenly exhausted. I don't know. Vivian, this is insane. A duke wants to marry me. Me, the invisible daughter, the forgettable one. It can't be real. But what if it is? Vivian sat beside her. What if you found exactly what I'm hoping to find with a Thaddeus? Real connection. Real partnership. Love. Love, Eleanor repeated. The word felt enormous, impossible. Don't throw it away because you're afraid, Vivian said fiercely. Don't make yourself invisible because it's safer. Be brave enough to be seen. Eleanor looked at her sister, beautiful golden Vivian, who'd spent her life being seen for all the wrong reasons and was now fighting for the chance to be invisible enough to choose her own path. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Eleanor said. You want to disappear. I'm terrified of being visible. And we're both trapped by Father's desperation. Then we escape together, Vivian said. You toward the Duke, me toward Thaddeus if he'll have me. We choose ourselves, Ellie. For the first time in our lives, we choose ourselves. Eleanor took her sister's hand and squeezed it tight. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, gilding everything with the particular light of late September in Newport. In 1 week, Eleanor would attend a dinner at Marlowe House. In 1 week, she would step fully into the light, let herself be seen, allow herself to hope. In 1 week, everything would change. But first, she had to find the courage to believe she deserved it, and that Eleanor thought might be the hardest challenge of all. The week before the dinner passed in a strange, suspended tension. Eleanor felt as though she were walking a tightrope stretched between two impossible futures, one where she remained invisible, safe in her shadows, and another where she stepped fully into the light and risked everything. Harrison had become unbearable in his desperation. He alternated between icy silence and sudden eruptions of rage, always when the Duke wasn't present. He'd forbidden Eleanor from reading in the library, claiming she was neglecting her duties. He'd assigned her menial tasks, supervising the laundry, inventorying the pantry, as though trying to remind her of her proper place. But he couldn't forbid the Duke's visits. And Nathaniel came every day, Sometimes they walked in the gardens, Vivian trailing behind as chaperone, maintaining a discreet distance that allowed them the illusion of privacy. Sometimes they sat in the drawing room debating philosophy, while Harrison watched from across the room, his jaw working with suppressed fury. With each conversation, Eleanor felt the walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble. Nathaniel was nothing like the Duke she'd imagined from society gossip. He was brilliant, yes, but also kind, passionate about justice and reform, but humble about his own accomplishments. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, weighing her words as though they mattered. Because to him, they did matter. She mattered. It was the most intoxicating and terrifying feeling Eleanor had ever experienced. 3 days before the dinner, a letter arrived for Vivian. Eleanor was in the morning room when she heard her sister's cry, not of distress, but of joy so pure and overwhelming that it seemed to shake the foundations of Bancroft Manor. She rushed upstairs to find Vivian in her room clutching a letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. He wrote back. Vivian gasped. Thaddeus wrote back. Eleanor closed the door behind her and sat beside her sister on the bed. What does he say? Vivian's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter, reading aloud. My dearest Vivian, your letter reached me at Fort Laramie 3 weeks ago. I have read it 17 times, and with each reading, my heart breaks anew at the suffering you've endured and soars with hope that you might still feel for me what I have never stopped feeling for you. I left Newport 3 years ago, believing I had lost you forever. Your father made it clear I was unworthy, that I had nothing to offer a woman of your station. I went west thinking distance might cure me of loving you. It did not. Every sunrise reminded me of your hair. Every beautiful thing I witnessed felt incomplete because you weren't there to share it. I am returning to Boston. I have requested a transfer to Fort Independence, which has been granted. I will arrive in mid-October, 3 weeks from the date of this letter. I have saved every penny of my pay. It's not much. I cannot offer you mansions or jewels or the life your father envisioned for you, but I can offer you my whole heart freely given. I can offer you partnership and respect and a love that has survived 3 years of separation without dimming. I can offer you the chance to choose your own path, even if that path leads away from me. If you still wish it, Vivian, I am yours. I have always been yours. Your devoted servant, Thaddeus Ashford. By the time Vivian finished reading, both sisters were crying. He's coming back, Vivian whispered. He still loves me. Of course he does, Eleanor said, pulling her sister into an embrace. How could he not? 3 weeks. He'll be here in 3 weeks. Vivian pulled back, her expression shifting from joy to panic. But father will never allow it. He'll forbid me from seeing Thaddeus. He'll lock me in my room if he has to. He's too desperate, Ellie. The creditors are circling. We have less than 3 months now. Eleanor's mind raced. 3 weeks. The dinner at Marlowe House was in 3 days. If Nathaniel was going to propose, and Eleanor was increasingly certain he was, it would be soon. Perhaps at the dinner itself or shortly after. But what about Vivian? What about saving her sister from being sold to the highest bidder? An idea began to form, audacious and terrifying. What if we had a plan, Eleanor said slowly. What if we used father's desperation against him? What do you mean? Father wants a duke for this family. He's fixated on Nathaniel marrying one of us to save us from ruin. Eleanor took a breath. What if we gave him what he wants? Or at least the promise of it? Vivian's eyes widened with understanding. You'd marry the duke. If he asks, if this is real. Eleanor's heart hammered at the admission. Nathaniel told me he'd pay father's debts as a wedding gift, not as payment for me, but because he has the means and we need help. But that's Eleanor, that's everything father wants. You'd be saving us. Which means father would have no reason to force you into an unwanted marriage. You'd be free to wait for Thaddeus, to choose for yourself. Vivian gripped Eleanor's hands. But what about you? You can't marry the Duke just to save me. That's exactly what father's been trying to force me to do. It's not the same, Eleanor said, and realized as she spoke that it was true. I'm not marrying Nathaniel for money or duty or to save the family. I'm marrying him because... She paused, the words catching in her throat. Because you love him, Vivian finished softly. Did she? Eleanor examined her heart, testing the weight of the emotion. The way her pulse raced when Nathaniel entered a room. The way his smile made her feel like she could fly. The way their conversations filled a hollow space inside her she hadn't known existed. The way she'd started imagining a future, their future, in vivid, dangerous detail. Yes, Eleanor whispered. I think I do love him. Is that insane? It's been 2 weeks. Carolyn Bronte wrote that souls recognize each other in an instant, Vivian said. Perhaps you and the Duke recognized each other that first day in his library arguing about Wollstonecraft. Perhaps, Eleanor allowed, but loving him and marrying him are different things. Marriage is forever. What if I'm not enough? What if he wakes up one day and realizes he chose the wrong sister? Vivian cupped Eleanor's face in her hands, forcing her to meet her eyes. Listen to me, Ellie. You have spent 22 years believing you're not enough because father and society told you that beauty was all that mattered. But the Duke doesn't see you the way they do. He sees your brilliant mind, your courage, your authenticity. He sees you the way you deserve to be seen. I'm terrified, Eleanor admitted. Good. That means it matters. Vivian smiled through her tears. Be terrified, but be brave enough to reach for what you want anyway. They held each other, these two sisters who'd spent their lives on opposite sides of an invisible wall, now united in rebellion against the world that had tried to define them. 3 days later, Eleanor would attend the most important dinner of her life. But first, she needed to face the ghosts in her own mind, the voices that whispered she wasn't beautiful enough, smart enough, worthy enough to be chosen by a duke. The voices that sounded suspiciously like her father's. The evening of the dinner arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though September itself was holding its breath. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her bedroom, while Vivian fastened the buttons of her gown, a creation in deep sapphire blue that had arrived from Marlowe House that morning with a note in Nathaniel's hand. I noticed you favoring blue. I hope this pleases you. N. The gown was exquisite, far finer than anything Eleanor had ever owned. The silk seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, the cut modern and elegant without being ostentatious. It made her eyes look luminous, her skin glow. For the first time in her life, Eleanor looked in the mirror and didn't see someone plain and forgettable. She saw someone who might be worthy of a duke's love. You're beautiful, Vivian said softly. Ellie, you're absolutely beautiful. It's the gown. It's not the gown, it's you. You're glowing. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. This is what happiness looks like on you. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Harrison's voice tight with tension. The carriage is ready. We cannot be late. Eleanor took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and followed her sister downstairs. Harrison waited in the entrance hall, dressed in his finest evening clothes. His eyes swept over Eleanor, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or resentment that his invisible daughter could look so striking. The Duke sent that gown, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He's courting you. Still not a question. Harrison's voice was flat, defeated. Despite everything, despite Vivian, despite sense or reason, he's chosen you. Eleanor met her father's eyes without flinching. Yes, he has. And if he proposes tonight, what will you say? It was the first time Harrison had asked her, directly acknowledging her agency in the matter. Eleanor considered lying, deflecting, but she was done with invisibility. I'll say yes, she said quietly. If he asks, I'll say yes. Harrison's face worked through a series of emotions: anger, relief, grief, resignation. Finally, he nodded once sharply. Then don't embarrass us, he said. The Duke's guests will be influential people, political figures, reformers, people whose opinions matter. I know who they'll be, Father. Nathaniel told me. The use of the Duke's given name made Harrison flinch, but he said nothing. They rode to Marlowe House in heavy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor watched the Newport estates roll past in the gathering dusk and felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Tonight, something would happen tonight. She could feel it in her bones, in the electric tension that seemed to charge the very air. Marlowe House blazed with light, every window, golden torches lining the drive. As their carriage pulled up to the entrance, Eleanor could see other carriages arriving, elegant equipages, bearing Newport's elite and Boston's intelligentsia. This wasn't a simple dinner party. This was a gathering of minds, a salon of the type Nathaniel hosted regularly, where ideas were valued over pedigree and substance mattered more than status. The butler who greeted them at the door led them not to the east drawing room where they'd first met, but to a larger space, a dining room that could seat 40, though tonight perhaps 20 places were set. The walls were lined with paintings, the table gleaming with silver and crystal, but the atmosphere was charged with intellectual energy rather than stuffy formality. Nathaniel stood near the fireplace, engaged in animated conversation with an older woman Eleanor recognized from the society pages, Margaret Fuller, the transcendentalist writer and advocate for women's rights. When he saw Eleanor enter, his expression transformed. He excused himself and crossed the room in 3 long strides. Miss Eleanor, he said, bowing over her hand. His eyes held hers, and Eleanor saw everything in that gaze: admiration, desire, hope, and something that looked very much like love. You look magnificent. Thank you for the gown, Eleanor managed. It's far too generous. Not nearly generous enough, he said quietly. Then louder for her father's benefit. Senator Bancroft, Miss Vivian, welcome. Please let me introduce you to the other guests. What followed was a whirlwind of introductions. Eleanor met reformers and activists, writers, and politicians, women who'd fought for the right to own property, and men who championed abolition. The dinner conversation ranged from women's suffrage to labor reform, from international trade policy to the role of government in regulating monopolies. It was exhilarating, challenging, exactly the kind of intellectual discourse Eleanor had dreamed of but never thought she'd experience. And Nathaniel watched her throughout, his eyes tracking her as she debated with a senator about voting rights, as she challenged a railroad magnate's assumptions about workers' conditions, as she held her own in discussions of politics and philosophy with some of the sharpest minds in America. She was in her element, and everyone could see it. Harrison watched with an expression Eleanor couldn't decipher. Vivian beamed with pride, and Nathaniel looked at Eleanor as though she were the only person in the room. After dinner, the party moved to the library for coffee and continued discussion. Eleanor found herself in a corner with Margaret Fuller, debating the merits of various approaches to achieving women's suffrage. You have a remarkable mind, Miss Bancroft, Margaret said. Have you considered using it in service of the cause? We need intelligent women willing to speak publicly to right to organize. I've never thought I could, Eleanor admitted. I've spent most of my life being told to be quiet and decorative, and yet here you are holding your own with senators and scholars. The Duke was right about you. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Right about me, Margaret's eyes twinkled. He told me weeks ago that he'd met someone extraordinary, someone who reminded him that partnership between intellectual equals was possible. I see now he wasn't exaggerating. Before Eleanor could respond, Nathaniel appeared at her elbow. Margaret, forgive me for stealing Miss Eleanor, but I was hoping to show her something in the conservatory. If you'll excuse us. Of course, Margaret said, her smile knowing. I'll continue our discussion another time, my dear. Nathaniel offered Eleanor his arm, and she took it, her heart beginning to race. The conservatory, private, away from the other guests. This was it. They walked through the library, down a corridor lined with portraits, and through a door into a glass-walled room filled with exotic plants. The conservatory was lit by hundreds of candles, their light reflecting off the glass walls to create a universe of stars. It was breathtakingly beautiful. I wanted to speak with you, Nathaniel said, closing the door behind them. Alone. Is that all right? Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. He led her to a bench near a fountain where water trickled over stones with a sound like quiet laughter. For a moment, he just looked at her, and Eleanor felt exposed under that gaze, seen in a way that was both terrifying and wonderful. Tonight, he said finally, I watched you debate with some of the most influential minds in America. I watched you challenge assumptions, defend positions, build arguments that made senators reconsider their views. I watched you shine. Nathaniel, let me finish, please. He took her hands in his, and even through their gloves, Eleanor felt the warmth of his touch. 2 weeks ago, I told you that you reminded me what it felt like to be alive. That was true, but it wasn't complete. He paused, gathering courage. Eleanor, you don't just remind me I'm alive. You make me want to live, fully, passionately, to build something meaningful with someone who challenges me and inspires me and sees the world with the same hunger for justice and truth that I do. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I know it's fast, Nathaniel continued. I know society will say I'm making a poor choice, that grief has addled my judgment, that I should have chosen your beautiful sister instead of the invisible girl in the corner. Let them say it, I don't care. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Eleanor Bancroft, will you marry me? Will you be my partner, my equal, my wife? Will you build a life with me where substance matters more than surface, where your mind is valued as much as your heart, where you're seen and celebrated every single day? He opened the box, revealing a ring, a sapphire the exact color of her gown, surrounded by diamonds, that caught the candlelight and threw sparks of fire across the conservatory walls. Eleanor stared at the ring, at Nathaniel's face, at the hope and fear and love written there so plainly. All her life she'd been invisible. All her life she'd believed she wasn't enough. Not beautiful enough, not charming enough, not worthy of being chosen. But here was a man who saw her completely and chose her anyway, who valued her mind, respected her opinions, and wanted to build a future where she could be fully, authentically herself. Here was everything she'd ever wanted and never dared to dream she could have. I'm terrified, she whispered. I know. Society will be cruel. They'll say terrible things. Let them. I don't know how to be a duchess. I'll make mistakes. I'll embarrass you. Nathaniel smiled, and it transformed his grief-marked face into something luminous. Eleanor, you could never embarrass me. You could only ever make me proud. He paused. So what do you say? Will you marry me? Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw her future written there. A future of intellectual partnership, of being valued for who she truly was, of building something meaningful together. A future where she was seen. Yes, she breathed. Yes, Nathaniel. I'll marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and Eleanor watched the sapphire catch the light, hardly believing this was real. That she was here engaged to a duke chosen for her mind and her heart, rather than her beauty. Nathaniel stood pulling her up with him, and then his hands were cupping her face and he was kissing her gentle. At first, then deeper, more passionate. Eleanor melted into the kiss, into this man who'd seen her when the world had looked away, who'd valued her when she couldn't value herself. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said. I think I've loved you since the moment you argued with me about Wollstonecraft. I love you too, Eleanor whispered, and realized it was true. Completely, terrifyingly, wonderfully true. They stood like that for a long moment, savoring the intimacy, the sheer improbability of having found each other. Then Nathaniel said, we should tell the others. Your father will want to know, and I suspect Vivian is bursting with curiosity. Eleanor laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep and genuine. Yes, we should. They walked back to the library, hand in hand, Eleanor's sapphire ring catching the light with every movement. When they entered, conversation stopped. Every eye turned to them, to their joined hands, to Eleanor's flushed face and shining eyes. Nathaniel addressed the room, his voice carrying authority and joy in equal measure. My friends, I have an announcement. Miss Eleanor Bancroft has done me the extraordinary honor of agreeing to become my wife. For a heartbeat silence. Then the room erupted. Margaret Fuller rushed forward to embrace Eleanor. Other guests offered congratulations, genuine warmth in their voices. These were Nathaniel's friends, people who valued him and trusted his judgment. If he said Eleanor was extraordinary, they believed him. Harrison Bancroft stood frozen near the fireplace, his expression cycling through shock, relief, and something that might have been grief. His invisible daughter had captured a duke. The family was saved. But at what cost to his pride, his certainty that beauty was all that mattered? Vivian appeared at Eleanor's side, tears streaming down her face, pulling her into a fierce embrace. You did it, Vivian whispered. You chose yourself. You chose love. We both did, Eleanor whispered back. Thaddeus is coming. You'll have your chance too. The celebration continued around them, but Eleanor was aware of only a few things: Nathaniel's hand warm in hers, the weight of the ring on her finger, the joy blooming in her chest like a flower long denied sunlight. She was engaged. To a duke, to a man who loved her mind as much as her heart. Eleanor Bancroft, the invisible daughter, had been seen at last. The ride back to Bancroft Manor was surreal. Harrison sat across from his daughters in rigid silence, his jaw working, but no words emerging. Vivian held Eleanor's hand, squeezed it every few minutes, as though confirming this was real. Eleanor twisted the sapphire ring on her finger, still hardly believing it was there. Engaged. She was engaged to Nathaniel Marlowe, Duke and reformer, and the man who'd made her feel seen for the first time in her life. It wasn't until they were inside the manor, the door closed behind them, that Harrison finally spoke. The Duke will pay the debts. It was the first thing he asked, not congratulations, not concern for his daughter's happiness, just the mercenary question that revealed where his priorities had always been. Yes, Eleanor said quietly. He told me tonight, as a wedding gift, not as payment for me, but because he has the means and we need help. Harrison nodded once, then turned and walked toward his study without another word. Eleanor watched him go, feeling a complicated mix of relief and sadness. He'd wanted a duke for the family, he'd gotten one, but not the way he'd planned, not through the daughter he'd valued. The invisible daughter had saved them, and Harrison Bancroft didn't know how to process that truth. He'll come around, Vivian said softly, though she didn't sound convinced. Once the shock wears off. Maybe, Eleanor said. Or maybe he won't. Maybe he'll always resent that I was the one chosen instead of you. Then that's his loss. Vivian hugged her sister tight. I'm so happy for you, Ellie. You deserve this. You deserve everything. They climbed the stairs together, and Eleanor prepared for bed in a daze, her mind replaying the evening in vivid flashes. The dinner conversation, the conservatory, Nathaniel's proposal, the feel of his lips on hers. She was getting married, building a life with a partner who valued her mind. Everything was changing. Sleep was impossible. Eleanor lay in bed watching moonlight paint silver patterns across her ceiling, the sapphire ring heavy and wonderful on her finger. A soft knock at her door. Vivian again slipping into the room like a ghost. "Can't sleep either?" Eleanor asked. "No." Vivian climbed into bed beside her, the way they'd done as children during thunderstorms. "I keep thinking about Thaddeus. He'll be here in less than 3 weeks. And when he arrives, I tell Father I'm marrying Thaddeus, not whoever he's picked out, and if he tries to stop me, I'll elope." Vivian's voice was steady, determined. "You showed me it's possible, Ellie, to choose yourself, to demand to be seen." "It's terrifying," Eleanor admitted, "but worth it." Eleanor thought of Nathaniel's smile, his eyes the way he looked at her as though she hung the moon and stars. "Yes," she said, "completely worth it." They lay together in the darkness, two sisters who'd spent their lives on opposite sides of an invisible divide, now bound together by rebellion and hope. Outside Newport slept unaware that the social order it held so dear was about to shift. Because Eleanor Bancroft, the invisible daughter, was about to become a duchess, and she was going to use that position to change everything. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Nathaniel came daily, always with some excuse: a book he thought Eleanor would enjoy, a political pamphlet he wanted her opinion on, a question about the wedding plans. But really he came because he couldn't stay away. And Eleanor couldn't fault him for that, because she felt the same magnetic pull. Every moment apart felt like time-wasted hours they could have spent talking, laughing, learning each other. They set the wedding date for mid-October, a small ceremony at Marlowe House, rather than a grand society affair. Eleanor wanted intimacy, not performance. Nathaniel agreed immediately. "I've had one grand society wedding," he said quietly. "This time I want something real. Just us and the people who matter." The people who mattered turned out to be a surprisingly small group. Margaret Fuller and a few of Nathaniel's closest friends. Vivian, of course. Harrison, because propriety demanded it, though his presence would be a formality rather than a celebration. And Eleanor hoped Colonel Thaddeus Ashford. He arrived in Boston on a bright October morning, 3 days before Eleanor's wedding. Vivian had been watching the Post obsessively, and when his telegram came, "Arrived Boston. May I call?" she'd cried for an hour straight. Eleanor helped her sister dress for Thaddeus's visit, choosing a gown of soft rose that made Vivian look less like a society beauty and more like a real woman, flushed, nervous, gloriously human. When Thaddeus was announced, Vivian gripped Eleanor's hand so hard it hurt. What if he's changed his mind? What if seeing me again reminds him why Father was right, that I'm just a pretty face with nothing underneath? "Then he's a fool," Eleanor said firmly. "But he's not. He loves you. Trust that." Colonel Thaddeus Ashford was taller than Eleanor remembered, his face sun-bronzed from years out west, his cavalry uniform impeccable. But it was his eyes that mattered, the way they found Vivian across the drawing room and lit up with such pure joy that Eleanor felt her own throat tighten. "Miss Vivian," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Colonel Ashford," Vivian managed. They stared at each other for a long moment while Eleanor and Harrison looked on. Then Vivian crossed the room in 3 running steps and threw herself into Thaddeus's arms. Propriety be damned. Harrison made a strangled sound of protest, but Eleanor laid a hand on his arm. "Let them have this," she said quietly. "Please." For once, Harrison didn't argue. He watched his elder daughter cling to a cavalry colonel with no fortune and no prospects, watched her cry into his shoulder, while he murmured reassurances and seemed to finally understand that some things mattered more than money. Love, for instance, and choice, and the courage to be oneself. After a few minutes, Thaddeus and Vivian, separated enough to be proper, though they remained standing close, hands joined. "Mr. Bancroft," Thaddeus said, turning to Harrison, "I've come to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage. I know I'm not the match you wanted for her. I have only my officer's pay and my honor. But I love Vivian with everything I am. I'll spend my life making her happy if you'll allow it." Harrison looked at his eldest daughter, at her shining eyes and radiant smile, and something in his rigid expression finally cracked. "You'll provide for her?" he asked, his voice gruff. "I'll do my best, sir. My transfer to Fort Independence means we'll be stationed near Boston. The pay isn't much, but it's steady, and I'm studying for the bar exam. If I pass, I can practice law while maintaining my commission." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Vivian, is this what you want, truly?" "More than anything," Vivian said, her voice trembling. "I love him, Father. I've loved him for 3 years. I'll love him for the rest of my life." Harrison closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were wet. "Then you have my blessing," he said quietly. "Both of you." Vivian made a sound between a laugh and a bum and hugged her father for the first time in what must have been years. Harrison stood stiffly for a moment, then his arms came up to hold his daughter, and Eleanor saw his shoulders shake. He was crying. Harrison Bancroft, who'd been too proud to show weakness, too desperate to show love, was crying as he held his eldest daughter. "I'm sorry," he whispered just loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "Vivian, I'm so sorry for everything." "I know, Father," Vivian said. "I know." Eleanor slipped from the room, giving them privacy for this moment of reconciliation. She found herself in the garden, the October air crisp and smelling of fallen leaves and the last roses of the season. 3 days until her wedding, 3 days until she became Eleanor Marlowe Duchess, 3 days until her entire life transformed. She wasn't afraid anymore. Or rather, she was afraid, but the fear no longer paralyzed her. Because Nathaniel was right, some things were worth being terrified for. Love, partnership, the chance to build something meaningful, the chance to be seen. She heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to find Harrison approaching. He looked older than she'd ever seen him, the weight of his choices etched into every line of his face. "Eleanor," he said, "may I speak with you?" She nodded, waiting. Harrison took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was raw. "I've been a terrible father to you, worse than terrible. I made you invisible because acknowledging you would mean acknowledging my own failures. Every time I looked at you and saw your mother's intelligence, her independence, her refusal to be decorative, I saw everything I couldn't control." Eleanor said nothing, letting him continue. "I told myself you were plain forgettable, not worth my attention. But the truth is you terrified me. Because you were exactly like your mother, brilliant and brave and utterly yourself. And I knew I couldn't break you into the shape I needed. So I pretended you didn't exist." His voice cracked. "And I am so, so sorry." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "Father, no, let me finish." Harrison's hands were shaking. "You are extraordinary, Eleanor. The Duke sees it. His friends see it. Even I, stubborn and blind as I've been, can see it now. You have saved this family. Not by being decorative or charming, but by being authentically yourself." He paused, gathering courage for the next words. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I've stolen 22 years of acknowledgement from you. I've made you feel worthless when you are worth more than I could ever measure. But I'm asking anyway. Please, forgive me." Eleanor looked at her father, this man who'd hurt her so deeply, who'd made her feel invisible for most of her life. Part of her wanted to refuse to make him feel the pain he'd inflicted on her. But she thought of Nathaniel, of the way love had transformed her, given her the courage to step into the light. And she thought of Vivian and Thaddeus reunited after 3 years of forced separation. Holding on to bitterness would only hurt herself. "I forgive you," Eleanor said quietly. "Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry this pain anymore. But Father, forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. You can't erase 22 years of harm with one apology." "I know," Harrison said. "I know, but I'm asking for the chance to do better. To be the father I should have been from the beginning." Eleanor studied his face and saw genuine remorse there, genuine desire to change. "Then be better," she said. "Starting now, with Vivian and Thaddeus, with me and Nathaniel, be the father we deserved all along." Harrison nodded, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I will, I promise, I will." They stood in the garden as the afternoon light faded to gold, father and daughter, beginning the long work of healing wounds too deep to be cured by words alone. But it was a beginning, and sometimes Eleanor thought beginnings were enough. The wedding day dawned clear in bright October at its most glorious. Eleanor dressed in a gown of ivory silk, simple and elegant, with Vivian's help. "You're beautiful," Vivian said, fastening the last button. "Truly beautiful, Ellie." "I'm terrified," Eleanor admitted, watching her reflection in the mirror. "What if I'm not a good duchess? What if I can't navigate society, can't be the wife Nathaniel needs?" Vivian turned Eleanor to face her, gripping her shoulders. "Listen to me. Nathaniel isn't marrying you to have a decorative duchess. He's marrying you because you're brilliant and brave and utterly yourself. Be that. That's all he wants. That's all he's ever wanted." Eleanor took a deep breath and nodded. The ceremony was held in Marlowe House's private chapel, a small stone building on the grounds that could seat perhaps 30 people. Eleanor had invited only those who mattered: Margaret Fuller and her fellow reformers, Nathaniel's closest friends, Vivian and Thaddeus and Harrison. As Eleanor walked down the short aisle on her father's arm, she saw Nathaniel waiting at the altar, and everything else faded away. He looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. And when Harrison placed her hand in Nathaniel's and stepped back, Eleanor felt the last chains of invisibility fall away. They spoke their vows in the golden afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows. Nathaniel promised to honor her mind as much as her heart, to be her partner in all things, to see her every day of their lives. Eleanor promised to be brave enough to be seen to build something meaningful with him, to love him with all she had. When the minister pronounced them, husband and wife, Nathaniel kissed her with such tenderness that Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks. She was married. To a duke. To the man who'd seen her when the world had looked away. Eleanor Bancroft was now Eleanor Marlowe Duchess, and she was going to use that position to make sure no other girl ever had to feel invisible again. The reception was held in Marlowe House's gardens, intimate and joyful. Eleanor danced with her husband under the October stars, and when he whispered, "I love you," against her ear, she whispered it back without fear. Later, much later, after the guests had departed, and Vivian and Thaddeus had announced their own engagement to general celebration, Eleanor and Nathaniel stood on the terrace of Marlowe House, looking out over the moonlit gardens. "What are you thinking?" Nathaniel asked, his arm around her waist. "That I spent 22 years invisible," Eleanor said, "and it took only one person truly seeing me to change everything." "You changed everything," Nathaniel corrected gently, "by having the courage to be yourself. I just recognized what was already there." Eleanor leaned into her husband's embrace and smiled. "What happens now?" she asked. Now, Nathaniel turned her to face him, his eyes warm with love and promise. "Now we build something extraordinary together. We'll use our position to champion reforms. We'll support women's education. We'll create change." He paused, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "And we'll be happy, Eleanor, genuinely, authentically happy, because we chose each other, not for duty or money or family obligation, but for love." Eleanor rose on her toes to kiss him, this man who'd seen her, valued her, loved her exactly as she was. "Yes," she whispered against his lips, "we chose each other, and we're going to change the world." Above them, the October stars wheeled in their eternal dance, witnesses to a love that had transformed two people and would soon transform many more. Because Eleanor Marlowe, the former invisible daughter, was done hiding in shadows. She was stepping into the light, and she was bringing every other invisible girl with her. The October morning was crisp and bright as Eleanor Marlowe stood before the assembled crowd in the courtyard of Bancroft Marlowe College for Women. 200 young women sat in neat rows, their faces bright with anticipation and hope. Behind Eleanor, the main building rose in elegant red brick, its cornerstone engraved with words she and Nathaniel had chosen together: "Here you will be seen." Nathaniel stood to her left, their son Alexander, called Xander, balanced on his hip. The boy was 4 years old, dark-haired like his father, with Eleanor's gray eyes and insatiable curiosity. He clutched a book to his chest, already learning to find comfort in stories. On Eleanor's right, Vivian held 2-year-old Catherine, named for both Nathaniel's first wife and the Vivian's mother-in-law. Cat, as they called her, had Vivian's golden hair and Thaddeus's steady temperament. Vivian and Thaddeus stood together, his arm around her waist. He'd passed the bar exam 2 years ago and now practiced law in Boston while maintaining his officer's commission. They lived modestly but happily, choosing love over luxury. Harrison Bancroft sat in the front row, older and quieter than he'd once been, but present. He'd kept his promise to do better, though the work of earning his daughter's trust was ongoing, measured in years rather than moments. Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, where their third child grew. She and Nathaniel hadn't told anyone yet, wanting to savor the secret a little longer. But today wasn't about her family. Today was about the young women before her, girls from all backgrounds and circumstances, united by hunger for knowledge and the courage to pursue it. Eleanor took a breath and began to speak, her voice carrying across the courtyard. 5 years ago, I was invisible. Not because I was plain or unremarkable, but because society had decided that women like me, women who read philosophy and debated politics, who had opinions and refused to hide them, didn't deserve to be seen. The young women leaned forward, listening intently. One man saw me anyway. My husband, Duke Marlowe, looked past what society valued and saw what actually mattered: my mind, my courage, my authenticity. He gave me the gift of being seen. Eleanor paused, her eyes sweeping across the sea of young faces. But being seen by one person, no matter how wonderful that is, shouldn't be necessary for us to value ourselves. We shouldn't need a man's validation to know we matter. We shouldn't have to be chosen to know we're worthy. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. This college exists so that you will never feel invisible. Here your intelligence is celebrated. Your ambitions are supported. Your voices matter. You will be seen by your professors, by your classmates, by yourselves. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. You will study philosophy and science, literature and mathematics. You will debate and discuss and disagree. You will learn to think critically, to question assumptions, to build arguments. You will become the women society needs, even if society doesn't know it yet. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel, who smiled at her with such pride and love that her heart swelled. Some of you will become doctors or lawyers. Some will be writers or reformers. Some will be mothers and wives who teach their children that intelligence and compassion matter more than status or wealth. All of you will change the world simply by refusing to be invisible. She paused, letting the words settle. 27 years ago, I was born into a world that had no place for girls like me. Today, we create that place together. Welcome to Bancroft Marlowe College. Welcome to a place where you will be seen, valued, and celebrated for exactly who you are. The applause started slowly, then built to a roar. The young women rose to their feet, some crying, some laughing, all transformed by the promise of what this place represented. Eleanor stepped back from the podium into Nathaniel's embrace, Xander squirming between them. That was perfect, Nathaniel murmured against her ear. Catherine would have loved it. Eleanor felt a pang at the mention of his first wife, but it was gentle now, a sweet ache rather than sharp pain. She'd learned to honor Caroline's memory while building her own life, to understand that Nathaniel's heart was large enough to hold love for both his wives, past and present. "Mama," Xander said, tugging on her dress, "can I go to school here?" Eleanor laughed. "This school is for young women, darling. But we'll find you a place that celebrates learning just as much." "Promise, promise." As the crowd began to disperse, families reuniting, new students chattering excitedly about their rooms and their classes, Eleanor looked around at what they'd built. The college had been her idea, but Nathaniel had embraced it completely. Together, they'd use their wealth and influence to create something that would outlast them both, a place where invisible girls could become visible women. Margaret Fuller approached, her eyes wet. "Eleanor, my dear, you've done something extraordinary here." "We've done something extraordinary," Eleanor corrected. "This belongs to all of us." Vivian appeared with Kat on her hip, Thaddeus close behind. "Ready for the family dinner Mrs. Patterson has been cooking since dawn." They walked back toward Marlowe House together, this family they'd chosen and built blood relations, and chosen family united by love and mutual respect. Harrison walked with them, carrying Xander when the boy's short legs grew tired. Eleanor watched her father with her son and felt something complex and healing. He would never be the father she deserved as a child, but he was becoming the grandfather Xander and Kat needed. Forgiveness, Eleanor had learned, wasn't a single moment but an ongoing choice, and she chose it daily for her own peace as much as for family harmony. That evening, after dinner had been eaten and children put to bed, Eleanor and Nathaniel stood on the terrace of Marlowe House, the same spot where they'd stood on their wedding night. 5 years, Eleanor mused. It feels like 5 minutes and 5 lifetimes all at once. "Are you happy?" Nathaniel asked, though he must have known the answer. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Eleanor said honestly. "I have you. I have our children. I have work that matters. I have a voice that's heard." She turned to face him fully. "I'm not invisible anymore, Nathaniel. And it's not just because you saw me, though, that started everything. It's because I finally see myself." Nathaniel pulled her close, his hands settling over her stomach where their third child grew. "You were never invisible, love. You were just waiting for the world to open its eyes." Eleanor smiled and kissed her husband as the October stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their wedding, their children's births, the opening of their college. The same stars that would witness all the invisible girls who would come after Eleanor, who would find their voices, claim their space, and refuse to be unseen. Because Eleanor Marlowe, the former invisible daughter, had kept her promise. She'd stepped into the light, and she'd brought every other invisible girl with her. Above them, the stars blazed witness to a legacy that would endure long after Eleanor and Nathaniel were gone. A legacy of being seen, being valued, being authentically, courageously oneself. And that, Eleanor thought, as she stood in her husband's arms under the eternal stars, was worth more than any duchy, any title, any wealth. That was worth everything.